Mr. President, I come here today on December 10th, Human Rights Day, and I wanted to briefly discuss human rights because I would just say that while we've made great advances around the world in the cause of human rights, there are still a lot of roads to travel in that regard. And I think today is a good opportunity to take note of some of the struggles and challenges around the world with regards to human rights. The first issue I want to talk about with regards to human rights is modern-day slavery. And I think when people think about slavery, they think about the historic nature of slavery in this country or around the world. And it's hard to imagine that today, in the 21st century, that there are slaves in the world. It's even harder to believe that there are slaves in the United States, but the fact is that there are. It's been well documented that human trafficking around the world numbers in the millions. And of course, sex trafficking is a big part of that, and it's a grotesque part of that, and we're all aware of that. And it's a very serious problem. So too is forced labor type slavery, which you find around the world and even here in the United States. In fact, there is no major city in the United States that does not have an element of human trafficking and human slavery within its confines. And I think it's important to understand that exists, that it is real, that it is happening. And to that extent, to remember that there are things that we're trying to do here in this legislative body, here in the United States Senate and here in Washington, to deal with this issue. One of the issues that we're going to have a chance to do hopefully soon is reauthorizing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was sponsored last year by Senator Brown and Senator Leahy, and hopefully we can finish that before the end of this year, but if we can't, I hope early in the next Congress we'll address it. As you all know, there is also these reports that the State Department does on ranks countries around the world on the efforts that they're making to deal with human trafficking, and it actually ranks them in three tiers, the third tier being the worst, those nations that are not doing enough. And one of the things I hope we'll look at is how we reform the process of giving some of these countries waivers. There are countries that are perpetually on the list of the worst possible places with regards to government policy towards human trafficking, and yet they are getting waivers from the implications and the consequences of being a Tier 3 country. And there are countries that are getting that waiver every single year. So I hope we'll examine the process legislatively of how we grant those waivers so that we can have more information as to exactly why it is that our government is granting waivers to other governments and other nations that are not making any advances whatsoever on the cause of putting an end to modern-day slavery and human trafficking. Another thing we should take some time to look at is some transparency from the business community, particularly large international companies that do business around the world. And we should look for ways to encourage and incentivize companies to voluntarily report on their supply chains to ensure that the products that we're using here in the United States are not the product of human slavery or modern-day slavery around the world. We can do that as well. Obviously, we don't want to put any more onerous costs on our businesses. We'll be careful about how we approach it. But I think it's important that we know that products that are sold here in the United States are not indirectly or directly benefiting from slavery around the world. And that's something that I hope we'll remember, that human trafficking and human slavery is real. It exists all around the world, and it exists here in our own country. And I hope we'll continue to make strides to dealing with it. One last point on that is a few months ago, several of my colleagues and I sent a letter to the Village Voice, which is a newspaper here in the United States, which actively and unfortunately advertises in its back pages, including on a site called Backpage.com, advertises the services of people who are being held against their will in those circumstances. It's outrageous to believe that a major American publication continues to advertise the services of young girls and young boys, some of whom are minors, and is doing so shamelessly. And I hope that they'll heed our call to stop that from happening. It's a massive source of revenue for that company. It's outrageous, it's disgusting, it's grotesque. And I hope more of our colleagues will join us in writing a new letter to them and continuing to call attention to this, because it simply is unacceptable. Secondly, I want to turn to the issue of religious freedoms, which is another human rights cause around the world. And sadly, there are not enough advances being made in that regard. In fact, we're seeing some kind of step backwards with regards to religious liberty and religious freedoms around the world. In April of this year, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom released its latest report with some very grim news. And I want to go through a few of them. But important to understand that we're not talking about the countries here, we're talking about the governments here. And there are some governments that are aiding and abetting the persecution of not protected religious minorities. And I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of those countries, and I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of those governments. There are many. The list is long. But these are a few that I wanted to point to today because I think what we find is truly unacceptable. Let's start with the People's Republic of China, which is not exactly a beacon of hope for those who are looking for religious liberty. We all know, of course, the situation in Tibet, which is not just a religious issue, it's an ethnic issue, it's a cultural issue. And we see the self-immolation of folks that are willing to burn alive because it's so intolerable what they're going through, and the effort of that government to wipe out their identity. But it goes much deeper than that. Proselytizing Christians and Orthodox, non-quote patriotic, unquote Catholic Church in the country faces significant repression. You understand that the Chinese government actually authorizes the Catholic Church. Actually authorizes who the leadership of that church can be. Truly unique in all the world that you actually have a government that tells you who your bishops are, that tells you who gets to run your church. Well, if you worship outside of that setting, you're persecuted. There are others, of course, the Tibetan Buddhists that I mentioned before, but here's from the report, and it talks about that it's not just the religious believers who are facing persecution in China. Quote, this is from the report, the Chinese government also continues to harass, detain, intimidate, disbar, and forcibly disappear attorneys who defend vulnerable religious groups. So I think it's important as China assumes greater responsibility. And again, understand, we're not talking about the people of China. We're talking about the government of China, who is aiding and abetting and allowing this religious prosecution to go on. In fact, it is part of state policy. And we hope that with the change in leadership in China that's just taken place, there will be a change in attitude. The truth is that China has much to offer the world, and we hope for a peaceful, prosperous rise for the people of China. We look forward to working together with them to making the world a better place. But China cannot assume that role as long as there is not respect for religious liberties, as far as these practices are happening in that country with the direction of its government. Of course, Egypt's been in the headlines lately. I think it's been well documented that violence against particularly Orthodox Christians has been high. In 2011, this is from the report, violent sectarian attacks targeting primarily Coptic Orthodox Christians resulted in nearly 100 deaths, surpassing the death total of the previous 10 years combined. I think the Arab Spring has a lot of promise. I think it also brings with it some warning flags. And one of those warning flags is the persecution of religious minorities in places such as Egypt. And so as Egypt works its way forward, and we know that it has some problems today that they're facing in their own society with regards to what kind of government and what kind of powers it needs and should have, we should keep an eye on how the new constitution and how the new laws and the new government treat religious minorities, particularly Coptic Orthodox Christians, who in 2011 suffered the death of 100 of its members. Now, Iran does not have a sterling record on human rights, for lack of a better term, but its treatment of religious minorities is particularly egregious. The violations of religious freedoms in Iran include prolonged detention, torture, and executions based primarily or entirely upon the religion of the accused. Now, all religious minorities in Iran are at risk, but even the recognized non-Muslim religious minorities that are protected or so-called protected under their so-called constitution, Jews, Armenian, and Assyrian Christians, they face increasing discrimination, arrests, and imprisonment, according to the report. So too, by the way, are dissenting Muslims, basically Muslims that are not following the Shia line, were intimidated, harassed, and detained. That's the record of Iran, which of course has a terrible human rights record, but in particular with the issues of religious liberty. In Saudi Arabia bans any non-Muslim worship, and even private religious activities are suppressed if they are discovered. So I think it's important to point that out as well. Closer to home, on the island of Cuba, a place that, of course, is, because of my heritage, close and near to our heart, we keep a very close eye on what's happening there as well. Here's what the report finds. Serious religious freedom violations continue in Cuba. Violations by the Cuban government include detention, sporadic arrests, and the harassment of clergy and religious leaders, as well as interference in church affairs. The Cuban government also controls and monitors religious belief and practices through surveillance and legal restrictions. Russia. The report finds that the government increasingly used its anti-extremist law against peaceful religious groups and individuals, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslim readers of the works of a Turkish theologian. So Russia's a country that's beginning to backslide on religious liberty as well. Finally, here in this own hemisphere, just like Cuba, Venezuela, and the report finds that the violations of religious liberty include the government's failure to investigate and hold accountable perpetrators of attacks on religious leaders and houses of worship, and violent rhetoric from President Hugo Chávez's government officials and state media and pro-Chávez media directed at the Venezuelan Jewish and Christian communities. I think sometimes we take for granted the religious liberties we have in this country. We should never do so. The fact of the matter is that we may have some cultural divisions in America when it comes to religion. But one of the great, and that's not tolerable either, but one of the great things that we've had in this country since its inception is the belief in religious liberty and religious freedoms enshrined in our governing Constitution. It's something it's an exception rather than the rule around the world. I think our example should inspire the world in that regard, but I think we should always use our voice, our power, and our example to lead the way around the world on this Human Rights Day on the issue of religious liberty. And last but not least, the cause of women around the world is something that bears watching as well. And by the way, some of these issues are interrelated. When we talk about human trafficking and human slavery, a disproportionate number of those held in bondage around the world are young women and young girls. But on the issue of human rights in particular with regards to women, there are a couple parts of the world that are very troubling. Afghanistan comes to mind because just today we get the report that a senior advocate for women in Afghanistan was shot dead by unknown gunmen on Monday. It's the latest assassination against women's rights activists in the country. Najia Siddiqui was headed to her office in the eastern Laghman province when she was shot and killed. She was the head of the Women's Affairs Department for the province, and her predecessor in that post was killed just 4 months ago. The Taliban, which many hold responsible for the attack, has not yet had a comment, but it comes just a week after a teenage girl volunteering in an anti-polio drive was fatally shot northeast of Kabul. The Taliban has targeted senior female officials in the past for working in the U.S.-backed Afghan government. So that's just one issue, this coordinated attack to go after women who dare participate in the political life of the country. But it goes beyond that. There's this very troubling law that in Afghanistan, which the government claims to have tried to clear up. It's called running away, basically that some judges have interpreted the crime of running away have interpreted running away as a crime. And it's been used against young girls and women who run away from home because it's a home where they're being abused or a home where they're being forced to marry somebody. And there's some really sad stories that I want to share with you. One is from October of this year. A 17-year-old leapt from her roof in the streets of Kabul in an effort to avoiding marriage ordained by her grandfather when she was only 9 years old. The judge who heard the case mentioned that Farima, that was her name, had ruined her life. The judge stated that the court is a place where a woman can plead for divorce or custody of her children only if and when she has 5 male witnesses and a husband or a fiancé that condones the separation. This is the 21st century we're talking about. We're not reading something from history here. This is happening right now. Of course, we all know the story of that brave little girl in Pakistan that was shot. We hear these cases every single day. I think what we need to do today, and it goes on and on, I could be here for 3 hours, highlighting abuses against women, against religious liberty, the abuses of human trafficking and human slavery around the world. I think what's important today, on December 10th, on Human Rights Day, to take a moment and understand that the cause of human rights is not a partisan cause. It's not even a nationalistic cause. It is a human cause that requires each and every one of us to raise our voice and to call attention to any time and any place where human rights are violated. I want to congratulate the leading role this government has played in calling attention to those abuses around the world and in being honest with ourselves when these things are happening here at home. Of course, like anything else, you have to first set the example before you can lead. And that's why I think it's so important that on the issue of human trafficking and modern-day slavery, the United States have cutting-edge legislation that deals with an emerging problem that keeps changing. And so the laws have to adapt to it. And I hope we'll take the first step in doing that by authorizing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.